Roughly 6,000 years before the first video game, a group of people living near the Black Sea, what would now be Russia and Ukraine, built the first small wheeled carts. Sure, the concept of wheeling things around had existed before in some fashion. Using logs to roll blocks around tracks, say to build a pyramid, was a thing that had been done for some time. But this idea of creating and attaching wheels to a cart that would then carry the blocks, for example, this was new.
And from that point on, if you look at the archaeological record, you could just watch the wheel spread out from that location to everywhere in Eurasia. How did it catch on so quickly? Well, archaeologists think it's likely new people saw the wheel and were like, oh, I get it. Because, well, building a wheel isn't simple. Most of the cultures in the world had the technology to do it already. They just never had the idea for a wheel before. But once they did, that was it. Everyone started making wheels.
So what does this have to do with video games? Well, have you ever wondered who, or what, invented the wheel for video games?
I am Pat Holleman, game developer and a historian of video game design.
I'm Jesse Cox, game producer and Pat Holleman fanboy. And this is Big Ideas in Gaming. So let's define this for everyone, because inventing the wheel is kind of a loaded phrase.
Well, there are two games that could be the wheel. The first one is Space Invaders, but there are already a lot of good articles and videos on Space Invaders already. Honestly, I think the better game for inventing the wheel is Super Mario Bros., because in that game, Shigeru Miyamoto and Takashi Tezuka came up with a new idea for games, and like the wheel, that idea spread everywhere in the world.
And like the wheel, there were other games before Mario that had all the bits and pieces that made up Super Mario Bros.
Of course, just like with the wheel, people could still roll things from place to place, but the wheel was a fundamental change to that process. Super Mario Bros. Was the same in gaming. It was a new kind of game called a composite game. The problem is, almost everything you play today is a composite game. If we want to understand what a composite game is and why it was so revolutionary, we have to go back in time to explain what came before it.
Back to when exactly?
The 1980s.
I would make a joke about that being long ago, but I was alive then, so...
Wonderful, you lived through what I'm going to talk about.
Which is?
The Great Video Games Crash. In the early 1980s, video games were a booming business. Between home consoles and arcade revenue, the US video game market was worth about $8 billion. And because games were such a big deal, everybody was trying to get in on the action. Third-party game developers, which had only been around for 3 years at this point, started to release literally any piece of crap they could.
I think a sizable portion of the audience has seen videos from Angry Video Game Nerd and the like about how really bad things got. We're talking E.T. game bad. A game so awful they literally buried copies of it. There's straight up a documentary about it. It's amazing. You have to watch it. But that isn't even the half of it. Have you heard of Chase the Chuck Wagon? It was an Atari game that was made to advertise Purina dog food.
Or Tax Evaders, where you spend the whole game trying to hide your assets from the tax agency.
Well, I certainly would never play a game like that. I love the IRS and think they're doing just fine. Just fine indeed.
Nothing says fun like fiscal irresponsibility.
Or how about the game, and I'm not mispronouncing this by the way, Snake? An awful ripoff of Centipede that was clearly the inspiration for the Psycho Mantis voice.
I'm Psycho Mantis!
Or porn games like Custer's Revenge and Beat 'em and Eat 'em, which you should just don't even, just trust me.
Yeah, I don't see the problem there. Anyway, the point is, the video games market was full of crap in the early 80s, and the mainstream gaming audience started to get bored, so they stopped buying games. The US console market lost 97% of its value between 1982 and 1985. The number of games that came out also dropped way off too. People thought the personal computer was going to replace the game console forever. Even William Shatner.
The wonder computer of the 1980s, the Commodore VIC-20.
There was also a big design reason why the popularity of video games fell off in the 1980s. Back in the late 70s, Space Invaders had accidentally invented the first big idea in video games, the up and down difficulty structure that lots of people have analyzed already. The basic idea is that every level in Space Invaders got more difficult as the player got closer to the end. And then, each level started a little bit harder than the previous one.
This difficulty structure caught on really quickly in a lot of classic games. In Asteroids, the levels get more difficult as the asteroids break into smaller, faster chunks. In Missile Command, the levels get more difficult with more faster falling missiles. In Galaga, the game gets harder by putting more faster enemies on the screen. These games are all basically doing the same thing. They get harder the longer you play.
This idea is still super important to video game design, but by itself it's pretty repetitive. By 1983, it looked like the difficulty structure introduced by Space Invaders wasn't going to be enough to keep the industry going by itself. This was when the great video games crash happened.
So video games pretty much spent the next 2 years in limbo, which is good, because I'm sure 4-year-old Jesse had some other things he wanted to do at the time. And sure, games still came out. But the US video games industry had basically collapsed. Atari even delayed the release of their next-gen system, the 7800 Pro system. This left a huge hole in the home console market that someone could come in and fill. And that someone was Nintendo.
Over in Japan, the games market rebounded from the crash way quicker than it did in the US. Nintendo was getting into home consoles with the Famicom, which we know as the NES. The system was a hot seller in Japan, gaining Nintendo about 90% market share over there in the mid-1980s. Even though most people thought that video games were dead in America, Nintendo executives looked at that empty market and saw an opportunity.
Nintendo launched the NES all across America in 1986. And wouldn't you know it? Drumroll, please.
Can you do a drum roll for known historical facts?
It was a huge success.
Now, there were a lot of reasons why people loved the NES. It had cool peripherals, it was more affordable than earlier systems, it had a much nicer controller than any previous system. But one of the biggest things it had going for it was that it came with an all-time classic game, Super Mario Bros. For millions of people and the games industry at large, this was the title that changed everything. It's in the gameplay of Super Mario Bros. That we're going to find our big idea. But first, I should explain that Super Mario Bros. Came with some inherent advantages over earlier games. One was that most of the consoles and arcade machines that came before the NES, they couldn't have played Super Mario Bros. They didn't have enough power.
Earlier consoles didn't have enough memory to do a lot of things. The idea of a scrolling level was incredibly difficult to pull off.
Right. There were some scrolling levels in earlier games, especially arcades, but they were in much shorter games. Super Mario Bros. Has 32 different stages, which was a ton of content for the time it came out.
So it's possible that someone else might have come up with this big new idea before Super Mario Bros. If they had the right machine?
Yeah. In fact, Moon Patrol in 1982 came pretty close, but it didn't quite capture some of the important points that we're going to talk about.
Which, to remind everyone, is Mario being the wheel of gaming. So maybe we should, get back on that big idea.
Okay, so Super Mario Bros. Was the first composite game. A composite game is a composite, or combination, of two or more existing game genres. In the case of Super Mario Bros., those were the platformer and action genres. But you can't just mash any two genres together and get a hit like Super Mario Bros. You need to follow 3 important rules. Rule number 1 is, a composite game must allow the player to use the mechanics of genre A to solve the problems of genre B. In Super Mario Bros., that means that Mario can use platformer game mechanics, like jumping, to solve action game problems, like defeating enemies. And Mario can also do the opposite. Shooting Wing Koopas with fireballs is an example of using action abilities to make platform jumps easier. Jesse, if you'll consult the pamphlet I sent you, you will see number 2.
Okay. Is this laminated? Did you laminate this?
It's been a long quarantine.
Okay. Rule number 2, a composite game must always be both of its genres. In other words, Super Mario Bros. Is always both a platformer and an action game. The player never stops jumping and never stops fighting enemies. Some levels lean towards the platformer side and some lean towards the action side, but there's always an element of both in every level. If the game totally drops one of the genres, it's not really a composite game anymore.
And rule number 3 is, a composite game's levels move back and forth between genres. Even though every level in Super Mario Bros. Has both action and platformer elements, there are usually more of one than the other. So each level is oriented towards one of its genres. And that orientation changes pretty often. Let's look at an example level. Okay, no, we're skipping level 1-1. Everyone and their mother has already analyzed it. I literally have a subreddit where I collect Mario Bros 1-1 videos.
Really? How many have you collected?
15, including most recently, one in Italian.
All right, well then let's take a look at 1-2. So this level has 20 enemies in it, but only 6 deadly platform jumps. So you would say this is an action-oriented level, right?
Exactly.
But then if you look at 1-3, there are 16 deadly platform jumps, but only 8 enemies. So this is a platform-oriented level.
You've got it. And if you look at the rest of the game, you see that it goes back and forth between the two genres in a pretty regular way. Overall, there are more action-oriented levels than there are platformer-oriented levels in the game, which is probably because Miyamoto and Tezuka just hadn't come up with enough cool ideas for platforms yet. That would happen later in Super Mario Bros. 3. But combining genres in this way was the big idea, the idea that revolutionized video game design forever. Let's go back to that graph about Space Invaders. We have that up and down motion and difficulty that basically all games have, but now we can also move side to side along the x-axis. That's the back and forth motion between genres.
So that side to side motion, that must have solved a lot of problems for games, right? Because I don't know if people at home remember, but arcade games were super hard. But when I played Super Mario Bros, it felt different. It didn't feel like every level was significantly harder than the last one. It just felt like, hey, this is different. I remember it still being challenging, but also fun.
Right. That's the most important part of composite design. That up and down difficulty structure from Space Invaders is only one part of keeping players interested in the game they're playing. And it's important. Composite games still use it. But because they can also go side to side, composite games don't have to get really difficult really quickly like arcade games did.
And with the shallow difficulty curve, more people could enjoy the game. So Super Mario Bros. Was like the first game for everybody, wasn't it?
From a game design perspective, I think so. It didn't have modern features like accessibility controls, but you also didn't have to be a hardcore gamer to play it, and that broadened the audience for video games a lot.
Okay, I love all of this, but composite design wasn't the only reason Super Mario Bros. Succeeded, right? It had a lot of other things going for it, like Mario's jump physics were way more fun and intuitive than anything else that existed back then. The art was cute, the enemies were creative, and the soundtrack was great.
Yeah, there were a lot of reasons why Super Mario Bros. Was a huge success. And there's no wrong reason for liking it, or for liking any game, but what we're looking for is the invention of the wheel, right? An idea that spread really rapidly, and boy oh boy, did composite games take over the world.
Alright, let's jump back to the late 80s. Super Mario Bros. Invented a new style of game design and changed gaming. What are some other examples of games or other companies that were copying that style?
Well, I bet you can identify a few, because composite design is really intuitive. Just think of a game that combines two existing genres and then allows you to use the mechanics of genre A to solve the problems of genre B.
Mega Man.
Yeah. Mega Man is a composite of the platformer and shooter genres. In Mega Man, you have to use your platformer skills to dodge the never-ending barrage of enemy projectiles, and you have to use your shooting skills to clear platforms so that you can keep going.
All right, what about Mario Kart? That's got to be racing plus shooter, right?
Yep. You can use shooter mechanics, like red shells, to solve racing game problems, like the fact that you're in last place.
So that means Sonic the Hedgehog is platformer plus racing?
Yep. You use racing mechanics like building up lots of momentum and flying off ramps to solve platformer problems, like jumping to a platform that's really far away.
And then games like Legend of Zelda or Secret of Mana allow you to use RPG mechanics like finding secret gear and increasing your HP to help solve action problems like beating tough bosses that have crazy attack patterns.
Yeah, and the same thing is true of the Deus Ex games, where you can adjust your character build to help overcome tough FPS battles.
And Portal is one too, right? You can use FPS mechanics to shoot portals all over the place, and those portals let you jump from platform to platform.
Yeah, there are also some games which we think of as being separate genres that are actually composites too. The real-time strategy genre, for example. It's actually a composite of the traditional strategy genre, real-time action games, and economic simulations.
Okay, All right, then I have to ask this then. What is the weirdest composite game you can think of?
Good question. I'd say the weirdest composite is probably Katamari Damacy. If you think about it, it's actually a composite of the racing and RPG genres. Your basic mechanics are steering around crazy turns on an oddly shaped course before the time limit runs out. That's how old console racing games used to work. But then they also add in the whole growth dynamic, where you slowly get bigger and can roll over larger and larger objects. That's a level up system, and you definitely use both sets of mechanics to help you solve the problems of the other genre.
I never thought of Katamari that way. That's awesome. So basically, Super Mario Bros. Pulled a wheel and created a thing everyone kinda understood, but never did before, and as a result, spread quickly to developers and spawned all sorts of amazing games we know and love. Games we may cover in the future of this show. Wink.
If you want to know more about the stuff we talked about in this video, I've actually written a lot more about it. I have a book series called Reverse Design, which goes into way more detail about everything we covered here. There are links down below in the video description. If you're specifically interested in the birth of composite games, I recommend Reverse Design Super Mario World.
Let me stress, they are amazing. The Final Fantasy VI Reverse Design is how I found this man so many years ago. Definitely, you should check them out. Anyway, that's it for us, gang. Hopefully, you learned something new and we didn't take up too much of your time. By all means, if you want to see more, subscribe, like, whatever you gotta do on YouTube these days. Also, let us know your ideas. What kind of things should we talk about? What games do you want us to break down? Any fun concepts you think are worth discussing? We definitely want to hear what you think are big ideas in gaming. That's it for us. We'll see you next time.